What if the most powerful thing you could ever express is saying nothing at all? What if your silence becomes the very force that makes them unravel while you finally begin to recover? There is a strong psychological pattern that keeps people emotionally attached to someone who repeatedly causes them pain. It doesn't rely on love, comfort, or consistency. Instead, it thrives on intensity, on unpredictability, on repeated cycles of reward and punishment that train the nervous system to hold on even tighter the more it suffers. This is what we call a trauma bond. A trauma bond develops when affection and hurt become connected. One moment you're lifted up, admired, chosen. The next you're criticized, dismissed, or emotionally abandoned. The shift is so extreme that your mind starts chasing those brief positive moments with urgency. You're not really chasing the person. You're chasing relief. You're seeking the return of warmth after periods of emotional coldness. And this happens because the human mind is deeply wired for attachment. When connection feels threatened, the body reacts as though survival itself is in danger. Stress hormones rise, anxiety grows, you replay conversations, and you look for reassurance. When that reassurance finally appears, a message, a compliment, a brief moment of affection, it feels almost addictive. That feeling strengthens the bond. With time, the relationship stops being about compatibility or mutual respect. It shifts into emotional regulation. Your nervous system starts relying on them to soothe the very anxiety they trigger. This is why leaving becomes so difficult. Not because you are unable to live without them, but because your body has been trained to believe that you can't. Silence disrupts this pattern. When you choose no contact, no calls, no texts, no checking their online activity, you remove both the hurt and the temporary comfort. At first, this feels even harder. The body resists. It wants the familiar cycle back. You may feel overwhelmed, preoccupied, or even physically uneasy. Your mind might idealize past moments and overlook the damage that was done. This is not evidence that the bond was healthy. It is evidence that it was intense. Silence forces the nervous system to reset. Without outside stimulation, without new emotional spikes, the body gradually begins to calm. The absence of chaos may feel unusual at first. Quiet can seem empty when you're used to constant tension. But in that quiet, your mind begins to clear. You start recalling events more accurately. You begin noticing patterns you once excused. You see how often you changed yourself just to keep peace. You recognize how frequently your own needs were pushed aside. Distance brings perspective, and perspective breaks illusion. A trauma bond depends on immediacy. It requires ongoing interaction to stay alive. Every reply reignites it. Every argument renews it. Even conversations meant for closure often strengthen it because they increase emotional intensity. Silence removes the bond's fuel. As days turn into weeks, something subtle starts to shift. The urgency decreases. The cravings grow softer. The emotional highs and lows begin to even out. What once felt like fate starts to resemble dysfunction. The person you believed you couldn't live without becomes someone you can look at without trembling. This process is not linear. There will be moments of weakness, times when loneliness appears as love. But with continued silence, the nervous system keeps stabilizing. You start seeking validation within yourself rather than from others. Your sense of identity, once reshaped by constant emotional negotiation, gradually rebuilds. The mind has a natural drive toward wholeness. When removed from ongoing disruption, it seeks equilibrium. Silence provides the room for that recovery. It allows suppressed emotions to rise and be processed instead of being instantly soothed by the very person who created the distress. Grief replaces anxiety, and unlike a trauma bond, grief moves through you instead of trapping you. The longer the silence continues, the weaker the neurological link becomes. The brain stops connecting that person with comfort or survival. Emotional dependence loosens. What once felt magnetic begins to feel unnecessary. In that stillness, the bond doesn't break in a dramatic way. It fades quietly, strand by strand, as your system learns that safety does not come from chaos and attachment does not require pain. Control is the hidden currency in a narcissistic dynamic. What looks on the surface like love, passion, or even conflict is often rooted in something much more psychological. the need to control perception, emotion, and the overall narrative. A narcissist doesn't just want connection, they want influence. They want to shape how you view them, how you view yourself, and how the relationship story develops. Your reactions serve as proof of their power. When you argue, they feel important. When you cry, they feel impactful. When you defend yourself, they feel superior. Even when you try to reason with them, you are still engaging on their terms. Interaction confirms their relevance. Silence removes that validation. Initially, they may not respond openly. A narcissist often assumes silence is temporary, that you will eventually reach out, that your emotional dependence will pull you back into their orbit. They are used to repeated cycles, conflict followed by reconciliation, distance followed by a dramatic return. They rely on patterns in your attachment, but when silence continues, something unsettling begins to happen. Without your reactions, they lose access to emotional supply. Emotional supply is not limited to admiration. It also includes anger, fear, jealousy, and longing. Any strong emotion directed toward them reinforces their sense of importance. When that stream stops, it creates psychological discomfort. It is not that they necessarily miss you as an individual, they miss the control they once held over your emotional responses. Control depends on feedback. Silence provides none of it. When you do not react to provocation, their usual strategies start to lose effectiveness. They may increase their efforts to regain your attention. Subtle messages, indirect hints, nostalgic reminders, and even calculated displays of vulnerability may appear. Each attempt is meant to check whether the door is still open. If silence continues, the dynamic shifts even more. The narcissistic personality structure is often built on fragile self-esteem covered by grandiosity. External validation supports their internal instability. When someone who once offered steady attention withdraws completely, it creates a fracture in that structure. They may begin questioning their influence. They may quickly seek replacement sources of attention to compensate. They may also try to rewrite the story, presenting themselves as the one who chose to leave. These behaviors are not accidental, they are regulatory strategies. Silence removes the mirror they once used to see themselves as powerful. In many narcissistic dynamics, the partner becomes an emotional mirror responding, explaining, defending, and reacting. That mirror continually reinforces the narcissist's sense of importance. When it disappears, they are left alone with their internal reality, a place often filled with discomfort. Control also works through unpredictability. By keeping you unsure, warm then cold, present then distant, they maintain psychological leverage. When you choose silence, you introduce a new kind of unpredictability, one they do not control. They cannot predict your next step because there is no step. There is only absence, and absence cannot be manipulated. As days go by without contact, their usual tactics lose impact. Gaslighting requires conversation. Love bombing needs access. Blame shifting depends on dialogue. Without interaction, these tools sit unused. Their influence fades into memory rather than remaining an active force. Silence also shifts power internally. While they may initially feel frustration or restlessness, you begin to experience regulation. The less you respond, the less they can provoke. And the less they can provoke, the less control they maintain. Power in this situation is not loud, it is the quiet choice not to engage. Over time, the imbalance becomes visible. The dynamic that once centered around their moods and their timing starts to fall apart. You are no longer reacting to late-night messages. You are no longer defending your character. You are no longer looking for explanations behind contradictions. They may see this as rejection, indifference, or even disrespect. What unsettles them most is not anger, it's irrelevance. Being ignored challenges the illusion of indispensability. It disrupts the belief that they can enter your life whenever they choose. Silence communicates something they struggle to accept. Access is no longer guaranteed, influence is no longer automatic, and control has limits. When control fades, the structure built on it begins to weaken under its own instability. In a narcissistic dynamic, confusion is deliberate. Mixed signals, shifting stories, And emotional reversals create a psychological fog while you are constantly reacting, defending, explaining, or hoping your perception is accurate. You are too close to see clearly. Engagement keeps you inside the illusion. Silence moves you outside of it. When you stop responding, something subtle yet profound occurs. The emotional noise begins to fade. Without constant back and forth, you no longer feel compelled to decode every message or recover from every withdrawal. Your mind, no longer under siege, begins to observe instead of react. Observation changes everything. During interaction, a narcissist can shape their image in real time. They can charm, deflect, blame, shift, or gaslight. If confronted, they pivot. If exposed, they reinterpret. Dialogue gives them material to manipulate. Silence removes that stage. There is no audience to persuade, no immediate response to dominate. Without your engagement, their behavior becomes visible in its true form. Patterns that once seemed confusing begin to appear consistent. You start to notice how apologies rarely carried real accountability, how promises were intense but fleeting, how affection often appeared just as you began to pull away. Distance reveals patterns, and patterns reveal intention. Silence also uncovers motivation. When you stop reaching out, the nature of their attempts to reconnect becomes clear. Do they show genuine reflection, or do they rely on guilt, nostalgia, or subtle pressure? Do they respect your boundaries, or do they escalate when ignored? Their reaction to your absence often communicates more than their words ever did in your presence. Respect expresses itself quietly. Entitlement announces itself loudly without the need for direct interaction. You begin to notice how often conversations were redirected toward their needs, how frequently your feelings were dismissed, and how disagreements repeatedly returned to your faults rather than their actions. Distance allows memory to reorganize without distortion. The psyche has a way of reconstructing truth when it is no longer challenged in real time. Silence reveals another layer: their reaction to losing access. In healthy attachment, distance may bring sadness, but it does not trigger hostility or manipulation. In narcissistic dynamics, however, losing access can prompt efforts to reassert control. Smear campaigns, sudden displays of success, calculated vulnerability, these behaviors are not random. They are expressions of a threatened ego. When you are no longer available to manage their self-image, they must face their instability alone. You also begin to see who they are outside the fantasy you created. During the relationship, hope often filled the gaps. You imagined potential. You interpreted inconsistency as complexity. You explained contradictions as stress or misunderstanding. Silence removes projection. What remains is behavior without narrative embellishment. Consistency becomes the measure. You may notice how quickly they form new attachments, repeating the same intensity once directed at you, the same compliments, the same grand gestures, the same public displays. What once felt unique now appears formulaic. This realization can be uncomfortable, but it is also clarifying. Silence allows reality to surface without interference. It also reveals something about you. You notice how often you tolerated what made you uneasy, how frequently you doubted your own intuition, and how much effort you spent maintaining harmony. In the quiet, self-awareness grows alongside clarity about them. The absence of contact becomes a lens. Through it, you see that charm without empathy is performance, attention without respect is strategy, and intensity without consistency is instability disguised as passion. Engagement kept the spotlight moving. Silence holds it steady, and under steady observation, patterns cannot hide. Masks lose their function. Contradictions remain unresolved. The personality that once seemed magnetic becomes understandable in a different way, not mysterious, not profound, but predictable. When illusion fades, what remains is not the person you hoped they would be, nor the version they presented in idealized moments, but the sum of their repeated behaviors observed without emotional distortion. In a narcissistic relationship, identity erosion does not happen suddenly. It occurs gradually, almost imperceptibly. You adjust your tone to avoid conflict. You rehearse your words before speaking. You begin filtering your preferences through their approval. Over time, this adaptation becomes automatic. You may not notice how much of yourself you have edited, The dynamic slowly shifts from mutual exchange to a psychological orbit. Their moods set the atmosphere. Their reactions decide what is safe to express. You learn which parts of yourself earn validation and which invite criticism or withdrawal. Survival takes the place of authenticity. Silence interrupts this pattern. When contact ends, an immediate void appears. Without constant emotional monitoring, you may feel disoriented. For a while, your thoughts still revolve around them. You imagine their words. You anticipate reactions that no longer exist. This residue is natural. The mind does not detach immediately from patterns it practiced every day. But with sustained silence, the external reference point begins to fade. You wake up without checking your phone for their message. You make choices without calculating how they might respond. Small acts of autonomy accumulate. Choosing what to watch, what to wear, and who to meet, without negotiation or subtle fear, becomes restorative. Identity rebuilds through repeated independent decisions. During the relationship, you may have internalized their voice. Perhaps you questioned your memory because they denied events. Perhaps you doubted your sensitivity because they labeled you dramatic. Perhaps you minimized your needs because they framed them as excessive. These internalized criticisms can linger long after the relationship ends. Silence creates space to examine those echoes. Without new reinforcement, you begin to challenge distorted beliefs. You revisit moments of confusion and reassess them with clarity. You recognize that your reactions were often proportional to inconsistency. Your concerns were based on observable behavior. Your intuition was not irrational, it was suppressed. Reclaiming identity requires reconnecting with perception. It also opens the way to rediscover your own desires. In narcissistic dynamics, much energy is spent managing the other person. Your hobbies may have faded. Your social circle may have shrunk. Your ambitions may have been postponed to keep the peace. Silence returns both time and mental bandwidth. With that space, curiosity begins to reemerge. You may revisit music you once played, reconnect with friends you drifted from, or explore interests that once felt indulgent. At first, these actions may feel unfamiliar, even selfish. That discomfort reflects the extent of your previous over-accommodation. Gradually, enjoyment becomes less about permission and more about authenticity. Identity is not rebuilt through grand gestures. It grows through quiet consistency. Emotional regulation stabilizes without constant highs and lows. Your nervous system settles. You no longer anticipate sudden withdrawal or brace for criticism. The body relaxes. When the body relaxes, thought becomes clearer. Decisions feel less urgent, less reactive. You start responding to life instead of reacting to someone else's volatility. Silence also clarifies boundaries in the relationship. Boundaries that once felt negotiable or risky can now be defined without immediate challenge. Saying no longer automatically triggers guilt or conflict. You decide what behavior you will accept in future relationships. You practice self-trust without opposition. This is psychological strengthening. Over time, the version of yourself that revolved around them becomes less familiar. The hyper-vigilant self, the apologetic self, the over-explaining self, all of these begin to soften. In their place, a quieter confidence emerges, not loud or performative, but grounded. You recognize your preferences without needing justification. You experience emotions without self-criticism. You move through your days without strategizing around someone else's ego. Silence does more than remove a person from your life. It removes the constant external influence that shaped your self-concept. What remains is neither the person you were before the relationship nor the person you became within it, but an integration guided by awareness rather than fear. The fragments begin to align. The self that adapted for survival gives way to the self that chooses from clarity. And in that ongoing quiet, you continue reconnecting with parts of yourself that were never broken, only overshadowed. Power in a narcissistic dynamic is rarely about volume. It is about control over attention, emotion, and reaction. When you were entangled, power may have seemed to belong to the one who spoke the loudest, withdrew the fastest, or provoked the strongest reaction. But psychological power works differently. It resides in self-regulation. Silence is self-regulation in action. When you choose not to respond, you are not surrendering. You are opting out of a system that once thrived on your emotional output. This choice shifts the axis of control inward. Instead of managing their perceptions, you begin managing your impulses. Instead of correcting their distortions, you conserve your energy. Restraint becomes strength. In the past, you may have felt compelled to clarify misunderstandings, defend your character, or demand accountability. Each attempt likely drew you deeper into circular arguments. Words were twisted, intentions were questioned. Conversations ended where they began. Engagement kept you trapped within their psychological frame. Silence steps outside that frame. When you do not respond to provocation, you interrupt the expectation of access. Narcissistic dynamics depend on predictability, specifically predictable reactions. If they criticize, you defend. If they withdraw, you pursue. If they charm, you soften. Your responses become part of their strategy. Silence removes that strategy. The first time you ignore a message that would have once triggered anxiety, something internal shifts. You feel the urge to react, the discomfort of not explaining yourself, yet you remain still. That moment is transformative. You realize that reaction is a choice, not an inevitability. Choice is power. Psychological power is not about punishing the other person, it is about mastering your own nervous system. When you stop chasing closure, you stop outsourcing peace. When you stop correcting their narrative, you stop seeking validation from someone invested in misunderstanding you. The energy that once flowed outward begins circulating inward. You become less readable to manipulation. Silence also protects your reality. In toxic exchanges, repeated gaslighting can erode confidence in your perception. By disengaging, you prevent further distortion. You no longer expose vulnerabilities to someone who weaponized them. You no longer provide emotional data to be used against you. Containment becomes protection. Over time, this restraint builds internal solidity. You notice you can tolerate discomfort without acting on it. You can experience longing without contacting them. You can feel anger without expressing it destructively. Emotional maturity grows through these repetitions. You are no longer reacting to control, you are exercising autonomy. Silence shifts the dynamic of significance. Engagement signals that their words deserve a response. Silence communicates that not every action requires your attention. This recalibration changes perceived hierarchy. You are no longer scrambling to be heard. You are deciding what is worth hearing. Attention becomes selective rather than automatic. There is also a reclaiming of narrative authority. When you stop defending yourself against false portrayals, you detach from the need to correct every misrepresentation. You understand that truth does not require constant advertisement. Your character is expressed through consistency, not argument. Stability unsettles chaos. The more you practice silence, the less reactive you become, not only with them, but in other areas of life. You pause before responding. You assess before engaging. Emotional discipline extends beyond the relationship. What began as self-protection evolves into psychological refinement. You recognize that power is not forcing someone to understand you, it is being at peace whether they do or not. In this way, silence becomes less about them and more about you. It is no longer a tactic. It is a posture, a refusal to be pulled into dynamics that compromise your equilibrium, a commitment to internal authority over external drama. As that authority strengthens, you move through the world with a steadiness that does not require announcement, a confidence that does not depend on reaction, and a presence that does not compete for control.